September 14th, 1987, Vincent Sherry, a circuit court judge in Biloxi, Mississippi, and his wife, Margaret Sherry, a councilwoman and candidate for mayor, were shot to death inside their home. There was no forced entry. This was not a random act. This was deliberate and professional. Margaret Sherry had told friends she was working with the FBI to expose the current mayor for corruption. Vincent Sherry, being a judge, had plenty of people who may or may not have wanted him dead. He had even mentioned days leading up to his murder that he had received death threats. So at first glance, this looked like a case with no shortage of possible motives and suspects. Politics, personal retaliation, corruption, take your pick. But as the investigation unfolded, the focus shifted towards something far more structured, far closer than first realized, and far more unsettling. What investigators would eventually uncover wasn't just a motive. It was a system of corruption and fraud. An operation being run from inside a maximum security prison. Money moving from a law office and a loose network of criminals and scammers. And when problems couldn't be handled quietly, they were handled permanently. Welcome to the Southern Blueprint Podcast. I'm your host, Matt Swift. On this episode, we take a look at the murders of Vincent and Margaret Sherry and what the Dixie Mafia was. And that word mafia is used loosely. This wasn't like, New York, Chicago, or the Philadelphia crime families. There was no godfather per se, no true hierarchy, but what I do find interesting is when I read something about the Dixie Mafia or listen to another podcast, they talk about how the Dixie Mafia is not structured at all and how it's all scattered, etc. But when they actually start talking about it or actually start reading about it, it actually shows that it is pretty connected and there is sort of a structure, just not in the sense of what you think a mafia family would be. The Dixie Mafia, they weren't Italian mobsters. They were just some good old boys with connections who worked together and took advantage of the situations and the environment around them. The term Dixie Mafia was later applied by law enforcement and journalists to describe a pattern they observed across the South, particularly from the 1960s to the 1980s. But this story focuses on the brazen murder of Vincent and Margaret Sherry, the corruption that surrounded it, and what the Dixie Mafia actually was pertaining to this time and place. If you're a fan of the show, leave us a review and rating wherever you're listening to your podcast and tell your pals about us. And if you really want to support the show, we always have our Patreon page. It's called The Hidden Pine Lodge. You can find it on Patreon. And what that will get you, it's only $4 a month, but what that will get you is additional content about the episodes, as well as it gets you access to our community Discord. It's like Slack or Microsoft Teams, but, you don't have to talk about horrible work-related topics. We do talk about like fly fishing, bourbon, hiking, gardening, history, folklore, and tons of other things that we chat about in there. We actually have a book club, and we have a bird club. No, we're not all 80 years old. But I'll drop the link in the show notes, and I hope to see you over there. Let's get into this episode. Pete Hallett was the one who found the bodies of Vincent and Margaret Sherry. Pete was a dear friend and had been a partner at the same law office as Vincent before Vincent became a judge. Word of Vincent and Margaret's death spread quickly. You have a judge and a councilwoman that's running for mayor who were killed. Eric Sherry, Vincent and Margaret's son, had only learned about the horrible news when a friend called to offer her condolences after hearing what happened to his parents on the radio. Eric had no idea, and I really can't imagine learning that your folks were killed quite like that. Eric did know that he needed to call his siblings before they found out in a similar fashion. Lynn Sposito, Vincent and Margaret's daughter, had just moved to Raleigh, North Carolina. When Eric called her, giving her the news, it rocked her to her core. "What do you mean they'd been killed?" she asked. "Was it an accident?" "No," Eric told his sister. "They had been killed. They had been murdered." Lynn couldn't believe it. She got off the phone and was in shock. How was she going to tell her kids? She also needed to call her other brother, Vincent J. Sherry III. We'll just call him Vin. But she needed to call Vin and give him the news. But how could this happen? Then Lynn remembered a conversation she had had with her mom, Margaret, a few months before. Margaret had told Lynn that, quote, "things were getting hot down here," here being Biloxi, Mississippi. And Margaret told Lynn, "I am going to blow the lid off of this town." Margaret was a bit of a crusader who wanted to expose the corruption in Biloxi. Margaret told Lynn, "I just hope to God they don't come after my children." Lynn didn't think too much of the conversation at the time. It seemed like an exaggeration. Who says something like that? Her mom was always talking politics, and she was always very dramatic about these things. But now, her mom and dad were dead. "I hope to God they don't go after my children." Lynn kept thinking, who are they? Lynn called Pete Hallett, her father's friend and law partner. Hesitant at first to give her the details on the phone, he told Lynn that they had been shot multiple times. Judge Vincent Sherry had not shown up for court that morning, so Pete went over to the house to check on him. When he pulled up, their cars were in the driveway, so he knew something was wrong. Pete said he knocked on the door, then went inside because the door was not latched. He saw Vincent's feet lying on the floor and didn't want to see any more. He knew it was bad, so he called the police. At least now Lynn had a little bit of information and finally had to tell her kids what had happened as well. She broke the bad news to her daughter, Kathy, who was 16 at the time. And Kathy adored her grandmother, Margaret, and hung to every word she said about politics. They would talk endlessly about the political landscape in Biloxi, and she had helped her grandmother during her mayoral campaign in 1985, which Margaret had lost that campaign, but was going to help her grandmother and work even harder in 1989 as Margaret ran again. Kathy, after hearing this horrible news about her grandmother, stopped and asked her mom, Lynn, "Where the hell is Gerald Blessy?" Gerald Blessy began as mayor in 1981, the same year Margaret joined the city council. Blessy was a liberal Democrat. Margaret was a Republican. Blessy was Margaret's arch nemesis. Margaret accused Gerald of pretty much everything. Misspending government funds. She alleged that Blessy had the cops investigate her and that he had dealings with notorious underworld crime figures. Blessy, in turn, pointed out that it was her husband, Vincent, who at the time was not yet a judge. But he, as a criminal defense attorney, he was the one that was profiting from representing individuals engaged in illegal activities and vice. He also labeled Margaret as pretty much a racist. Needless to say, Gerald Blessy and Margaret Sherry, they hated each other. As I mentioned, in 1985, Margaret lost the election to Blessy, but Margaret would not go away. She had planned to run again in 1989 and claimed to pretty much to anyone who would listen that she was working with the FBI to document corruption in the mayor's office and throughout the entire city. That brings us to the Strip. The Strip in Biloxi, Mississippi in 1987 consisted of strip clubs, putt-putt courses, bars, and cheap hotels. It was a seedy place where illegal gambling and prostitution was okay, or at least people looked the other way. Former mayors and police chiefs, they did nothing to crack down on all the illegal activities going on at the Strip. In fact, some had allegedly profited from those very activities. This is the part of the Dixie Mafia. This is the part of what Margaret wanted to bring down. There was the Golden Nugget, which was a strip club and a front for other illegal activities. The owner's daughter of the Golden Nugget was the personal assistant to Mayor Gerald Blessy. As you can imagine, this was a point of contention for Margaret Sherry. But the Strip is where the Dixie Mafia made their base, taking over the prostitution, gambling, and drug dealing. The Dixie Mafia was fanned out over southern states. They would rob banks, they would steal cars, and even kill one another when needed, especially when someone ratted. That was really only the main rule. Just no one was supposed to rat, much like the Italian Mafia. If you ratted, you got dead. But we will come back to all of this later. Eric, Lynn, and even 16-year-old Kathy were now in Biloxi and met at Pete Hullett's office, per Pete's request, before reporters and police talked to them. Pete welcomed them in and said he would do anything he could to help the family. But then he said something sort of strange. He said, "Listen, there's something you need to understand. There is nothing that you can do to bring your parents back to life. Nothing. The best thing you could do is to drop it." Lynn at the time thought that maybe Pete had found something out, something bad. Lynn asked Pete, "Was it Blessy? Is that why you want us to drop this whole thing?" But Pete wanted them to mourn their parents and then go back home and live their lives. After the meeting, Kathy, the 16-year-old, turned to her mom, Lynn, and said, "I don't trust Pete." Kathy had never actually liked Pete in the first place, and at a very young age once said that Pete had evil eyes. But Pete was a family friend, Vince's best friend. Surely he was just trying to help in his own way. I mean, he just lost his best friend, right? Even Margaret had said that she had hoped that they didn't come after her kids. Maybe Pete was scared for them. So who killed the Sherrys? Was it Mayor Blessy, or was it a past client of Vincent Sherry? He had represented some pretty bad people. Was it someone that Vincent put away once he became a judge? No one seemed to know. There were lots of theories, of course, like all murders. But the police and the mayor were not sure who could have wanted the Sherrys dead or why. Vincent's wallet was still in his back pocket when the police arrived at the house. There was no murder weapon. There were no fingerprints, no forced entry, and there was nothing really destroyed. Margaret's purse was left. But there was one thing that was missing, which was brought up by Vincent and Margaret's youngest daughter, who was away at school at the time, and her name's Leslie. Leslie told authorities that there was a black appointment book that was missing, and Vincent never went anywhere without it. If he left the house and was 15 minutes down the road, it didn't matter. He would go back and get it. It had all of Vincent's appointments, whom he was supposed to meet and where he was supposed to be. So where was this book? It was nowhere to be found. The Sherrys were about to go out of town to visit their daughter, Leslie, who was in Baton Rouge. So someone knew their schedule or had been following them and knew the perfect time to strike it. It's over the weekend, right before the judge has to be back for court. They're about to travel. And the Sherrys also had two beloved dogs who were very protective, and they would have fought the intruder. Even officers mentioned how tricky it was when they tried to enter the home to get the two bodies. The dogs were aggressive. The Sherry kids believed it was maybe someone in the family and the dogs may have known. Because of that, investigators were actually first suspicious of Eric Sherry, the son who had, phoned Lynn at the very beginning of the story. They were curious what Eric was doing in Biloxi so quickly the day his parents were found dead, having to drive all the way from Florida. Eric and his parents didn't have the best relationship, and there was one major thing that not even Eric knew, but Lynn sure did. You see, Eric was actually adopted. Eric didn't know this, but the investigators somehow figured this out. Eric was very stoic and didn't show much emotion when he spoke with law enforcement. Officers thought that his actions were strange, and perhaps he knew or found out that he was adopted, and that was maybe motive, and he was angry. Lynn assured them that Eric did not know, and she begged law enforcement not to bring that up to Eric that he was adopted. Eric, not knowing he was under suspicion, was actually able to quickly dispel all these suspicions, or at least he thought, and the family thought that. He told them that a friend had called to, offer condolences only an hour after the story broke, so he immediately drove home, which is why he was in Biloxi so quickly. He heard the news, drove straight to Biloxi. Eric told them that he had called Lynn, and they'd all driven to Pete Hullett's office, recounting exactly, what Pete had told them about what he had found and how he had found their parents. All the siblings who were now in town had all corroborated the same story, really. But investigators would keep coming back to Eric and insist that Eric needed to take a polygraph test. Lynn, wanting to protect Eric, finally said, okay, under these conditions, the whole family would take one. But Mayor Blessy also had to take one. Now, again, Lynn, not a fan of the mayor, just like her mother. The mayor turned down the request and said that he would not be considered a suspect, which I'm sure made the family even more enraged. But the family story was all the same. They all said the same things to police. Eric, Lynn, all the other siblings, they all said the same things to police. And Lynn desperately wanted to clear Eric. But the only details that seemed a little off between what the family and the police were told, it kind of came from one person. There was some discrepancies and things were changing. And those discrepancies came from Pete Hullett. Pete Hallett was ambitious, well-connected, and comfortable moving between legal, political, and social circles in Biloxi. At the beginning of the investigation of the Sherry murders, the task force briefly considered Pete a suspect, even before Eric Sherry. Pete was potentially the last person to talk to Vincent, and he was the one who found the bodies. What he told the family and what he told the police about entering the home and finding the bodies differed, like I was saying earlier. But law enforcement found really no motive. Plus, he was Vincent's best friend. But at the same time that Pete was practicing law with Vincent Sherry, he was also representing a very notorious client, and that is one Kirksey McCord Nix. Kirksey Nix was already serving a life sentence at the Louisiana State Penitentiary, which was called Angola, and he was in there for a prior murder. But his incarceration did not stop him and did not isolate him. Nix remained in constant communication with people on the outside, and he exercised real influence. He was part of the Dixie Mafia, and he was a huge figure. From inside Angola, Nix organized a fraud and extortion scheme that operated for years. The mechanics of this scheme was pretty straightforward. It was a Lonely Hearts scam. Personal advertisements were placed, and these ads would be placed in magazines, and a lot of times they would be, posing as a lady. Correspondence was initiated with, men reaching out to these ads, and relationships were built either on the phone or, snail mail, writing letters and things like that. Once that relationship was built, the pressure began. Victims were asked for money. My car's broken down. I need money for hospital bills, et cetera, et cetera. And then once that started, then the threats and extortion happened. You see, a lot of these men were married or, in a relationship or had kids, and they were reaching out to these women. And so the people that were posing as women would then try to extort these men for additional, funds and everything like that. Also, too, a lot of these ads were ads by men for men. And back in the, early 80s, it wasn't wildly accepted to be homosexual, right? So what would happen is that inside this prison, and he would get other inmates to help him with the scheme. They would post these ads, and they would have conversations with these other men, and they would ask for money. And then if the victims were like, "I'm not giving you money," they were like, "Okay, well, we'll out you as a homosexual to your, maybe your wife and family, or your church, or your work." And so these schemes produced a ton of money. Lots of money moving in steady streams. And that money needed a legitimate looking channel. And Pete Hallett took that money from Kirksey Nix, knowingly or unknowingly where that money was actually coming from. But he took that money and he set it aside for Kirksey Nix. Criminal defense attorneys often have to deal with, we'll call them shady people. But we will come back to this Lonely Hearts scam later. Meanwhile, the Sherry kids were trying their best to find out what was going on and who killed their parents. Then, Vincent III, he was with Lynn, and the two siblings knew that they couldn't go to their parents' house as it was still roped off. So they went to their next door neighbor, Brett Robertson's. And they knocked on the door, and Brett quickly got them inside of his house. And Brett tells them that he saw the car. And they're like, "The car?" He's like, "Yes, or at least a car parked outside the night Monday around 10 p.m. It was a yellow Ford Fairmont." And this revelation stunned the kids. They had spoken to detectives, read every article that they could find, and yet police had claimed there was no one nearby that had seen anything. No one had said anything, no one had seen anything. But Brett continued. He goes, I even saw who was driving that car. It was a Biloxi cop. He wasn't in uniform. He was in plain clothes. But he knew who this man was because that officer had actually pulled him over once. Lynn and Vin struggled to process what they were hearing. A police officer outside the house at the exact time of the murders felt impossible to believe. If it were innocent, she thought, investigators would have talked about it publicly. A public patrol unit in the area would have been valuable information, something the police would have shared immediately. Instead, there had been silence. There was nothing about a yellow Ford. And if Robertson was telling the truth, that silence suggested someone had deliberately kept the yellow Ford out of the official narrative. She pressed him again, needing some certainty. Was he absolutely sure? Robertson didn't hesitate. He said he knew the man, recognized him without question. Lynn pushed further. Had he told anyone? Had detectives come by to ask, what he'd seen? Officers had supposedly canvassed the neighborhood after the bodies were discovered. Surely someone would have followed up on a car parked outside of the house the night of the murder. Robertson admitted the police had come and spoken to him, but he'd only mentioned seeing the car to them. He never described the driver in detail. Brett said that the guy typically doesn't, this guy doesn't typically drive that yellow car. He usually drives a white Impala. And this answer stunned Vin and Lynn. They couldn't understand how someone could hold back something that important. They were like, why did you not say anything? The reason, he said, was pretty simple. The officer that later came knocking on his door to do the investigation and follow up in the neighborhood was the same man that had been behind the wheel of that yellow Ford that night. Lynn and Vin left stunned. Lynn had to tell someone she could trust. And that person was Greg Brochard, who was a sheriff's investigator. She told him the story about the yellow car. He said that a yellow Ford was actually stolen off of a car lot. And after Lynn gave him the description of the man Brett had described in the car, Greg says, that sounds like Rick Kirk. She asked Greg, does Rick typically drive a white Impala or Caprice? And Greg said, well, yeah. Why do you ask? The autopsies of Vincent and Margaret and what was found at the home confirmed that a .22 caliber Ruger semi-automatic pistol was used in the killing. Vincent's body was not even in the closed casket at the wake. It was being looked over for evidence. At the wake, Pete Hallett was overheard talking to the coroner about the time of death, and Lynn heard all this. The medical examiner said that based on a parole officer talking to Vincent Sherry Tuesday morning, Vincent and Margaret had to have died that night or earlier in the day. And Pete said that was impossible. They had, they were dead long before that. And sure enough, after the full autopsy, the time or day of death was Monday, not Tuesday, as the medical examiner first said. And Lynn thought, now, how in the world would Pete possibly know that? The next day, at the funeral, Pete got up to say a few words. People were crying, and Pete gave a heartfelt goodbye to his friends. At the end of his remarks, he talked about Margaret, who everyone knew was going to run again for mayor. Pete said that Margaret would want us to continue her good fight for open and honest and accountable government. Pete, during the speech, in a roundabout way, at the funeral of Vincent and Margaret, announced that he was going to be running for mayor. Eric and Lynn looked at each other, startled. And sure enough, a few weeks later, Pete confirmed that he was running for mayor and said to the newspaper, "I wouldn't consider it if Margaret were in the race." After the funeral, the Sherry kids all returned home, but Lynn was still trying to find out all that she could. By then, investigators were grasping at straws. They had no clue who could have done it. But they were also making mistakes all over the place, or just flat out being negligent. Letters recovered from the Sherry's mailbox just disappeared. Lynn later learned that one of Vince's briefcases filled with documents and personal items vanished after being inventoried. Margaret's briefcase was inexplicably handed over to a city councilwoman who had been politically opposed to her, which is the most insane thing I have ever heard. Other pieces of evidence would simply just go missing or were forgotten altogether. Then came the issue with that yellow Ford. On September 22nd, more than a week after the murders, a patrol officer found this yellow Ford by accident. Investigators had supposedly searched the whole entire city and assumed that the killer had driven this car out of town. Instead, it had been sitting in plain view at the Gulfview apartment complex, which was less than a half a mile from the Sherry house. And it sat there for 8 days. Witnesses said it hadn't been moved since before the bodies were discovered. When technicians finally processed the vehicle, they hoped it would provide a breakthrough. Instead, they found signs of careful preparation. The interior lights had been disabled. The horn cover had been removed. The ignition itself, there was no obvious tampering. It wasn't, hot wired or anything like that. Even the license plate had been altered. It traced back to a stolen Oldsmobile with part of another plate cut out and glued over top of the other plate to make the Ford appear legitimate. Whoever had done this had really planned ahead. 2 partial fingerprints were recovered from the rear door window, along with hair and fiber samples. Enough evidence to compare it against a suspect once one emerged. This material was supposed to be sent to the FBI lab in Washington. It never was. Among the items recovered at the morgue that was in Judge Vincent Sherry's pocket was a small slip of paper with a woman's name and an out-of-state phone number written in handwriting, in his own handwriting. It should have been an obvious lead, right? Someone could have picked up the phone and called that number. Maybe it meant nothing. but maybe it changed everything. But no one ever followed through on this. And again, it comes back to just bad investigation, just negligence, or maybe something a little more sinister. I don't know. But investigators kept coming back to some of the usual suspects. They came back to Eric Sherry again because he, wasn't taking the polygraph test. But there was another person that they now had on the radar, and that was a person named Diamond Betsy Inman, who is a figure tied to international drug smuggling. And informants had claimed that Betsy had talked about wanting Vincent Sherry dead and may have arranged it while she was incarcerated. So these rumors began circulating that it was drugs were involved, and that was the motive. So because of this, they looked into Vincent's, history and connections, and there was this property in Kentucky that he owned, banking relationships that he maintained, and it just led investigators to start checking more into Vincent's background, who he had represented. He was a criminal defense attorney. Police learned that Vincent had taken possession of several of Diamond Betsy's assets after her arrest, which deepened this suspicion. Another informant claimed to have witnessed conversations about large quantities of cocaine and smuggling methods designed to avoid federal scrutiny. Competing theories began to form. Maybe Betsy had Vincent killed over legal disputes. Maybe a drug deal had gone wrong. Maybe the murders were meant for a larger warning. But none of these explanations answered the question investigators kept coming back to. Why was Margaret killed? Even detectives who entertained the idea that Vincent might have been involved in criminal activity struggled to explain why Margaret had been killed. She had been shot after Vincent in the master bedroom, apparently unaware of the danger until the gunmen entered, the bedroom. Friends and family insisted Margaret would never have tolerated any type of criminal behavior of any sort from Vincent. Years earlier, when Vincent had been linked to another controversial case involving weapons being removed from a client's home, Margaret had threatened to report him herself. She had drawn a hard line, one her family never forgot. That memory complicated every theory suggesting she died because of something Vincent had done. Meanwhile, the investigation drifted. There was just lots of hearsay, lots of theories. But evidence went untested, leads went cold, and suspicion moved in circles, drugs, corruption, revenge, without anyone proving how these pieces actually fit together. Investigators eventually interviewed Barbara Anderson more thoroughly. She was the informant who had told them all about Diamond Betsy and this whole scandal with drugs and property and everything like that. This whole thing was a complete bust. Betsy was an alcoholic and only knew what she knew because another officer had told her about this case. She really had no clue about anything. And then when they went to interview Betsy Diamond, or Diamond Betsy herself, she swore she had nothing to do with it, had no problems with Vincent, would never do this, didn't have the means to even pull this off. So it was a complete bust. So after that was a dead end, they come back to Eric Sherry. They had finally convinced him to take a polygraph, dangling his parents' life insurance policy over his head, basically saying it can't be paid out until the kids are cleared as suspects. While the officers were in Orlando, Florida, speaking with Barbara Anderson, they stopped by Fort Walton, where Eric was, to poke around and ask about Eric and interviewing his wife and his neighbors. And the polygraph would now not be necessary as they all corroborated the same story Eric had told the police. Again, another dead end. And this frustrated Lynn and the rest of the family because they felt like they were focusing on the wrong people and also focusing on their own family. Meanwhile, Lynn would learn two very interesting things. Her mother, Margaret, was indeed working with the FBI and had her sights on the current mayor, and also how the government was spending funds and just the overall corruption. But the second thing that Lynn found out was the FBI was also looking into a separate matter, a Lonely Hearts scam case. This led back to one Kirksey McCord Nix. As I already mentioned, Kirksey Nix was running this whole Lonely Hearts scam from prison, using other inmates in this whole scheme. Nix also had a girlfriend who was a senior partner, as sorts, in this whole scam, and her name was Laura Sharp. Now, the FBI had traced her phone number, making all these calls to Kirksey Nix in prison, and they were kind of building this case around this Lonely Hearts scam. The one that they had traced, the number that they had traced, was the exact phone number of the Pete Hallett and Vincent Sherry law office. You see, Laura Sharp worked at the law office. I mentioned one of the investigators earlier that Lynn was working with and trusted. So he had already had bills and call logs from the law office, as of course they were trying to figure out who may had motive to kill Vincent Sherry. With this new information and looking back through the log, this guy went to Pete Hallett with all of this information and everything, and Pete said that, yeah, Kirksey Nix was a client of his, and the phone calls were for that purpose. But, Greg counted all these calls up. And when he did, there were 345 calls placed between December 1986 and September 1987. And these calls were going from the law office to Angola Prison, where Kirksey Nix was. Now, yes, sometimes a criminal defense attorney has to call his client, but I think we can all agree 345 calls is a bit much. Lynn, to her credit, was not sitting around waiting for things to happen. She decided that things were not moving fast enough, even with the help of Greg. So she hired a private investigator named Rex Armistead. Armistead was not just some random private investigator. He had a long background in law enforcement, including time with the Mississippi Highway Patrol. And he had already spent years looking into the Dixie Mafia activity in Mississippi and along the Gulf Coast. That mattered because he did not come into the Sherry case thinking like someone working a clean, ordinary homicide. He understood that Mississippi, especially the Gulf Coast, crime and politics and law enforcement did not always sit in separate rooms. Sometimes they all sat at the same table. Rex Armistead took the case and he told Lynn, he's like, hey, I am going to look at everybody, and that includes your family. And what Rex really wanted to do first was to re-clear Eric Sherry. Eric had been looked at earlier by investigators, partly because, he had been in Biloxi so quickly after the murders and they didn't like his demeanor. But anyway, the investigators themselves had, gone down to Florida, like I mentioned earlier, and they had kind of cleared him. Rex did the same thing. He just went through the timeline of events and everything like that, and pretty much was like, okay, Eric is not a serious suspect. Lynn, of course, knew this about her brother and wanted, Rex and pretty much everybody to focus on other people. But Lynn, after Rex cleared Eric, was like, I really want you to look at Mayor, Gerald Blessey. I really want you to look at him thoroughly and hard. From the family's perspective, the mayor made sense. Margaret had fought him publicly. She had accused his administration of corruption. She had talked openly about running against him again. She had told people she was working with and at least giving information to the FBI about the corruption in Biloxi. This was, pretty well known around the community. So it was natural for Lynn to believe the murder was political, especially given the things Margaret had said before she died, like I had said at the beginning of the show. So she had Rex really look into the current mayor. But Rex, as he moved through the case, kept coming back to a different man and a different problem. He told Lynn that it wasn't Blessey that he was worried about. Rex said that he could not clear Pete Hallett. He just couldn't get past Pete. That was the point where the case started moving closer to home. Pete Hallett was not some vague figure in the background. He was Vincent's law partner. He was Vincent's really good friend. He was tied to Nix in prison. He had Laura Sharp working in and around the law office. He was the person who found the bodies. He was the person who told the Sherry children to drop it. He was the person who seemed to know things he should not have known, including details about the timing of the murders. And he was the person who stood up at Vincent and Margaret's funeral and in a very calculated and careful way positioned himself as the man who would continue Margaret's fight for open and honest government. Then, like I said, not long after that, he ran for mayor. What Rex started uncovering was the money moving from Nix in the prison to the law office. Rex also learned about Pete's connections to Nix that went all the way back to the 1970s and how those two men were connected or introduced. And that was through Mike Gillich, who was a well-known Dixie Mafia guy. Nix at the time was trying to position himself for some kind of pardon or release from prison. But there was only so much Pete could do, formally to try to get this guy out of a life sentence. But Pete found other ways to be useful to Nix. He handled the money, he managed assets, and he helped Nix operate outside prison while Nix stayed physically locked inside. Pete actually helped arrange the purchase of a house for Nix in Ocean Springs. On its face, that should have probably raised questions immediately. Nix was in prison, supposedly earning almost nothing, and yet there was money available for property and payments and maintenance. Pete Hallett acted as trustee on the mortgage and helped manage payments through a trust account. That arrangement created a structure where Nix from inside Angola could still control property and money on the outside. The arrangement expanded from there. Pete Hallett also set up a trust for Nix. His secretary helped manage it. Money came in and went out. Checks were written. Expenses were handled. Rent and payments moved through the system. It gave Nix an outside financial machine, and it gave Pete Hallett a central role in that machine. Then we have Laura Sharp, who entered the story in a much larger way. She was not just Nix's girlfriend writing letters from afar. She came to the Gulf Coast in 1985 and became embedded in the Pete Hallett and Vincent Sherry law office. She had access to phones, desk, office space, and records. She used the office like she belonged there. Pete Hallett had even signed affidavits identifying her as his paralegal, which gave her privileged access to Nix and others inside Angola. That detail is not small. It gave her a reason to meet Nix in spaces protected by attorney-client rules. It gave the operation a way to communicate under the cover of legal work. The attorney-client room at Angola became important because it created a channel that looked legitimate from the outside but could be used for something else entirely. If Laura could enter as a paralegal, she could carry messages, receive instructions, and talk with Nix in a way that was more protected than an ordinary prison visit or phone call. There was another inmate there, too, at the prison, a man named Bobby Joe Fabian. And like almost everyone in this story, he came with some baggage. He was not the kind of witness you would dream up if you were building a clean murder case. He was a prisoner, a criminal, and someone investigators had every reason to treat carefully. But Fabian had been close enough to the world of Nix to know things that were not public. He knew about Laura Sharp. He knew about the fake paralegal arrangement. He knew how the attorney-client room was being used. He knew how messages, documents, and instructions could move in and out of Angola under the cover of legal access. He would be very important later. And because of Fabian, what was starting to really take shape was the prison logs. Those mattered. The phone logs mattered. The visitor registration logs mattered. The Pete Hallett and Vincent Sherry office phone bills mattered. Investigators could start testing pieces of Fabian's story against things that existed actually on paper. Fabian started talking, and now investigators could check things. The phone records was one of the strongest early anchors, like I mentioned before. There were 345 calls between the law office and Angola. That was not a normal amount of casual attorney-client contact. This was like a routine communication every day. It was operational. It showed that Angola and the law office were connected over and over again during the exact period when the scam, the Lonely Heart scam, the missing money, and eventually the murder plot became central to the case. And when I say missing money, I'll come back to this because that's a really key part of this. As Rex and other investigators kept pushing, that missing money became the key. And what I mean by this, by late 1986, a large amount of money tied to Nix's operation was unaccounted for. The figure that gets repeated is roughly $100,000. That money was part of Nix's operation, part of his hope that cash could perhaps buy influence, legal help, political help, and even some path, toward freedom. Whether Nix believed that money could buy him a pardon was realistic is almost beside the point. Nix believed that this money or all this money could help free him. That money also represented power, leverage, and all types of possibility. When some of that money went missing and fingers started being pointed, there was one man kind of to point at as far as Nix was concerned, and that was Pete Hallett. Pete Hallett's like, I don't have your missing money, but I know who does have your missing money, and that is Vincent Sherry. It's this moment where the whole case pivots. Now, there was never a clean, definitive paper trail proving Vincent took the money or had any involvement. In fact, one of the central problems in the first trial about this whole thing was that the government had a hard time proving Vincent had ever actually stolen scam money at all. But inside a criminal system, proof is not always what matters. Belief matters. Blame matters. And if Pete Hallett told Kirksey Nix and Mike Gillich that Vincent Sherry was responsible, then Vincent became the problem. Now again, this is all happening right as Vincent is coming from the law office to being a judge. This is where the story becomes less about politics and more about how criminal systems enforce control. If this had been a normal legal dispute, people could have gone to court, right? They could have, demanded records. They could have hired accountants. But no one in this operation could do that because the money itself came from fraud and extortion. The dispute could not be resolved in public. It had to be resolved inside the system that created it. And now, Kirksey Nix had someone to focus on. This is where Mike Gillich comes back in. Now, like I said, Mike was involved in the Dixie Mafia. He had connections, and he was the bridge between Kirksey Nix inside Angola and people on the outside who could carry out instructions. If Nix wanted pressure applied, Mike Gillich could help. If Nix wanted someone found, Mike Gillich could help. If Nix wanted a problem removed, Gillich knew the kind of people who could be bought and brought into that conversation. According to the early information that Rex Armistead and investigators began developing, a meeting inside Angola in the spring of 1987 became central. Nix wanted answers about that missing money. And by then, Vincent Sherry had already been placed at the center of that accusation. And once that accusation entered Nix's world, the conversation was no longer about accounting. It was about consequences. Out of that accusation came the idea that Vincent had to be killed. The first version of the murder plot that investigators built around focused on John Ransom. Ransom was connected to Nix. He was connected to the scam network. He had a violent reputation. He was the kind of person investigators could believe might be used for a contract killing. And at this stage of the story, Ransom looked like the man responsible for the killing. Ransom became more believable to investigators because of the pieces that started collecting around him. One of those pieces came from Fabian. Another came from another lady called Kathy Warner, who acted as a kind of go-between in parts of the investigation and helped connect some of the communication between Fabian and Ransom. Another came from phone calls involving Angola, Laura Sharp, and Ransom himself. And then came the arrest in Georgia. When Ransom was arrested in Georgia, investigators found items that made him look even more dangerous and more connected to the world they were investigating. They found a silencer. They found foam rubber, similar to the material that could be used with a suppressor. They found contact information tied to Laura Sharp. They found stock certificates connected to the scam. None of that by itself proved he killed Vincent and Margaret Sherry, but it made the theory around him stronger because he no longer looked like just another name in the criminal orbit here. He looked like someone connected to money, guns, silencers, and the exact people investigators were trying to understand. Then something else happened. Bobby Joe Fabian, he went public. He appeared on television and named names. He accused Pete Hallett. He tied the murders to Kirksey Nix, Laura Sharp, and our guy here, John Ransom, and the broader scam and the whole operation of the Lonely Hearts thing. That moment changed the public nature of the whole case. The hidden story was no longer hidden. It was on television. And Pete Hallett, who by then, surprise, surprise, had become mayor of Biloxi. That's right. Pete Hallett had won election and was now the mayor. But with these very serious accusations, he had to respond publicly. Now, Pete, of course, denied everything. He held press conferences. He went on TV himself. He presented himself as a public official being attacked by criminals and liars. But behind the scenes, the records were still there. The prison logs were still there. The office calls were still there. Laura Sharp's access was still there. The money was still missing. And the Nix files were still an issue. And when I say the Nix files, all the files in the law office of Pete Hallett were not there anymore. Now, I'll come back to those missing files, but there was another witness in this whole thing that helped give shape to the John Ransom theory and him being the killer, and that was Charles Ledger. Ledger was an attorney connected to the Pete Hallett and Vincent Sherry law office. He worked there, and his memories became important for far more than one reason. First, he remembered seeing a man near the law office before the murder, someone who did not seem to belong there. Later, after Ransom, became public by seeing him on, being shown on TV, Ledger believed that was the man that he had saw at the law office. The detail that gave his memory more weight was that Charles, they called him Chuck, he remembers the guy that he saw had a limp. He remembered the way the man walked, and it later became known that Ransom had an artificial right leg from an old shotgun injury. That detail had not been widely public when Ledger first described it to law enforcement, which made his identification harder to dismiss as, just guesswork. Ledger was also very important to this whole thing because, you see, Ledger also went to the Sherry house the morning that Pete Hallett went. Ledger remembered Pete Hallett taking him along to the house, remembered Pete Hallett driving a blue Mercedes, which was tied to the Nix and Mike Gillick's world, and he remembered Hallett rubbing his hands nervously during the drive. At the house, Ledger's memory of what happened did not line up neatly with the simple version of the story Pete had given. According to Ledger, Pete did not just walk straight through the front door that was unlocked and just stumble upon Vince's body and immediately call for help. Before going inside, Pete actually moved around the outside of the house. And the way Ledger remembered it, Pete avoided the most direct path that would have allowed him to see clearly into the den area where Vincent's body was located. When Pete finally entered the house, he was only inside briefly before coming back and saying that Vince was dead. But then he said Margaret was dead too. That detail bothered people later because under Ledger's versions of events, Pete did not seem to have had enough time to get through the house, reach the back bedroom where Margaret was, and see that she was actually dead. And Pete's account, Ledger's account, both was kind of like, Pete went inside the door, saw Vincent's feet, and then immediately come out. So how did he know that, one, Margaret was in the house, and two, that she was actually dead? Now, I guess, one could assume that if Vincent's dead, maybe Margaret's dead. But it's an odd detail, right? And there were other odd details from the discovery scene. Ledger remembered Pete warning people not to touch anything before the scene had fully become an official crime scene. And maybe, again, that's smart. That's maybe instinct. Maybe it was caution. He was a criminal defense attorney after all. He probably knew, but he told everybody, don't touch anything. But again, that kind of, I guess, struck Ledger at least kind of odd. But what makes Ledger's regulation more powerful is that he did not come off as someone, determined to destroy Pete Hallett. They were also partners and worked together. He seemed conflicted. He remembered Pete appearing like devastated at times, but also weird at times. He wondered whether Pete had been acting, but he couldn't say for sure. And that certainly makes the witness more believable because real memory is rarely perfect, especially when a person is trying to make sense of something years later, as Ledger was at the time. Ledger also helped reinforce Laura Sharp's role in the law office. He remembered her taking up space, using the phones, using the office library, and operating in a way that suggested she had far more access than she herself had later admitted. That whole thing mattered because Laura's office access was one of the main bridges between Nix's prison operation and the outside world. She was not floating around the edges. She was embedded in the place where the money, the phone calls, and legal cover overlap. So Ledger's own testimony and what he gave the investigators kind of corroborated, Laura Sharp was heavily involved in the law office and had access to all these things. There was also another lady named Ann Chris, who was Pete Hallett's law office manager. Now, right before Fabian went public with his accusations against Nix and Gillich and Pete Hallett himself, he had Ann Chris retrieve the Nix files from the law office. Now, remember, Pete is the mayor, but he had her go get the files from the law office and bring it to him. Now, that raised another obvious question. Why did Pete Hallett suddenly need those files gathered or moved right at that moment? By the time prosecutors started preparing the first federal trial, the case had become stronger and weaker at the same time. It was stronger because the scam operation was coming into total focus. They had all the information there. The government could show fraud. They could show extortion. They could show money movement, calls, prison access, and a network of criminals tied together through Kirksey Nix. But the murder case itself was still difficult. They did not have a clean confession. They did not have a murder weapon recovered from a defendant. They did not have forensic evidence, and that simply ended the argument. They had a conspiracy case built through compromised people, of course, and the government strategy became almost unavoidable. They could not prove the murders through one clean piece of evidence. They could prove the world around the murders, of course, like I've been saying. They could show the jury that Nix, Ransom, Laura Sharp, Mike Gillich, and others were professional liars, scammers, extortionists, and violent people in general with motive, connections, and the ability to arrange a killing. That was smart, but it was risky because the defense had an obvious response. Being a scammer and just kind of a criminal in general does not automatically make you a murderer. The indictment itself showed how difficult the case was. Prosecutors, they argued internally about whether they had enough to indict at all. The direct murder evidence was thin, so the government used interstate travel for hire status as part of the case because that gave them a federal path into the murder conspiracy. One of the most important decisions was not to indict Pete Hallett at this stage. Looking back, that seems almost unbelievable, right? Kind of what we know, hindsight being 2020. But at the time, prosecutors were not sure they could win against him. He's the mayor. That is crucial because people often look back and assume the government had the whole thing figured out from the beginning, and they certainly did not. They weren't sure how they were going to prosecute this case, even though they had all of this evidence. But definitely the murder part was the tough thing to figure out. For Lynn, the indictment was painful in another way. Her mother, Margaret, felt almost erased from it. The case centered so heavily on Vincent, the money, and the theory that he had been killed over the scam operation that Margaret's death seemed treated like an afterthought. To Lynn, it felt as if her mother did not even exist in the legal narrative. That mattered because Margaret was not a minor part of the story. She was a political force. She was the one fighting corruption. She was the one who had warned that things were, getting hot down in Biloxi. And she ended up being murdered in her own bedroom. But to Lynn, at least, it was seen that Margaret was kind of a afterthought in this whole thing. But on September 30th, 1991, more than 4 years after Vincent and Margaret Sherry were killed, the federal trial began in Hattiesburg. The prosecution had a hard job. Their witnesses were awful in the way that, witnesses in organized crime cases are often awful. They're criminals, they're scammers, they're informants, they're former associates, people trying to save themselves, people with motives, people with records, people whose stories had shifted. The defense knew that immediately and built its strategy around it. Jim Rose, representing Nix, argued that the real scam was not the Lonely Hearts operation, but the government's case itself. He told the jury that the government's witnesses were looking for freedom, money, and attention. He made the case about credibility before prosecutors could make it about the murder. The defense also raised a serious question that could not be ignored. If Vincent Sherry was supposedly killed because he stole scam money, where was the proof that he had actually stolen it? The government could show the scam. It could show Kirksey Nix wanted money. It could show that Pete Hallett handled money. It could possibly show Pete Hallett blaming Vince. But proving that Vincent actually took the money was something else entirely. For the defense, that was the wedge. If the motive was not proven clearly, the murder theory became weaker. And that's kind of the interesting thing here, and also kind of looking back, with all the information that we have. It's very clear, or hopefully it's clear to you, that Vincent probably didn't take the money, right? It's probably going to be someone else. Probably the person that blamed him, right? But as this case unfolds, because of that accusation, no, Vincent took the money, if they can't prove that he took the money, then how is there a scam? They can prove the scam through call logs, and people had come forward that were actually scammed in this whole thing, and they were testifying too. So they could actually prove the scam. But if they couldn't prove that Vincent had stolen the money, what's the motive for the murder? And that's, to me, kind of the interesting part about the first trial here. the government did have one kind of crucial witness that could testify, and that was Peggy Graham. She was Peggy Williams, but by the time of the trial, she was Peggy Graham. And let me tell you, she was rather angry that she was being dragged into court. She wanted nothing to do with John Ransom, Kirksey Nix, and that whole old scam network. But the prosecutors were kind of nervous about getting her on the stand and what version of events that she was going to tell, because she had changed her story a little bit. But like I said, she was also angry that she was having to be in court. And she wasn't tying John Ransom to the killing itself. She was not there to say, I saw John Ransom kill Vincent and Margaret Sherry. She was there to kind of give some background about who John Ransom was. Now, John Ransom, if you remember, he's the one that supposedly killed Vincent and Margaret. He was the one that supposedly did this. Now, Peggy was involved she would pick up Western Union transfers. She knew all the codes and what to do, and she knew how all the money moved around. And that was crucial because the government's case against John Ransom was not built around one, clean piece of physical evidence. It was built through association, pattern, and capability. Prosecutors needed the jury to understand that Ransom was not some random man whose name had been thrown into the case by desperate inmates, right? And that's kind of why Peggy was there, to solidify who John Ransom was, what he was about, what he did. She was able to speak about the guns. She was able to speak about the silencers and everything like that, and just what type of man that he was. And also, too, she was credible because she was in this whole scam system. So she was pretty critical early on to lay the groundwork and fight the defense's theory, like, oh, these are all criminals, they're just trying to save themselves. Well, Peggy was here to kind of counteract that. She goes, I was involved, yet I'm going to tell you who John Ransom was, and I could tell you exactly how he is, and I could tell you about all these guns, and again, the pistols, the automatic weapons, the silencers that this guy had. And again, that was a big part of the murder, because, couldn't find out, like, a silencer was used, and then here's John Ransom, having these homemade silencers and everything. Peggy was able to speak to all that. Peggy also described Ransom telling her violent stories about killings he had claimed to have committed. Whether every one of those stories was true was almost besides the point in the courtroom. The prosecution was trying to establish, capability. And Peggy gave them that. She gave the jury a version of Ransom that was not just shady, but really dangerous. She was telling the court that he had told her about other people that he had allegedly killed. And another detail that mattered was that there was a lack of, fingerprint evidence at the scene, like I mentioned. And Peggy told the courtroom that Ransom always wore gloves around guns. And that gave prosecutors a way to answer one of the defense's stronger points. If Ransom was careful around weapons, then the absence of fingerprints did not necessarily mean the absence of his involvement. As she testified, Ransom, began mocking her from the defense table. He was rolling his eyes, he made faces and tried to rattle her. And it worked. Peggy became emotional and shaken. She had not wanted to be there in the first place, and now the man she was testifying against was performing in the courtroom, trying to make her look unstable and ridiculous. By the time she left the stand, the scene had turned chaotic. Outside the courthouse, a cameraman rushed toward her, trying to capture the moment, and Peggy snapped. She swung her purse and hit him. It was messy, but it also showed what kind of trial this had all become. It was not a clean procession of polished witnesses. This was the underworld being dragged into the daylight. After Peggy, there were, numerous other witnesses that testified. One of them being Nix's former wife. And her and all the other, people that had testified had kind of painted the same picture, that Nix was dangerous, John Ransom is dangerous, Gillich, all these people had ties to, illegal activities and everything like that. But then old Pete Hallett was also called for testimony. And it was one of the most frustrating parts of the trial. Keep in mind, at the time, he's not a defendant. He's just on the stand and answering questions. And on the stand, he answered like a lawyer and a politician would. It's and if you read the transcripts, it is maddening. When he was asked a question, he would reframe the question. He nitpicked the language itself. He stalled. He qualified obvious statements. Prosecutors had to really pin him down with extreme precision. One exchange about the affidavits he signed for Laura Sharp became especially damaging to Pete. Now, Pete had sworn that Laura was his paralegal, which helped give her prison access, like we mentioned before. When asked whether that was false, he tried to maneuver around this, the answer here. But eventually he admitted he was technically false, that, she was not his paralegal. But then when he was pressed about it, and whether he signed a sworn affidavit, and when he was pressed on that, whether he had disregarded his oath, he admitted that, yes, he had disregarded his oath. And yes, that's bad, but yeah, no, she really wasn't his paralegal. That right there was kind of opened a lot of eyes for people. Then Kirk C. Nix took the stand, and he did exactly what a skilled con man would do. He admitted to the scams. He admitted to enough wrongdoing to appear candid. That was the strategy. He wanted the jury to think he was honest about being a scammer, but innocent of murder. In his version of events, too, everyone else was also innocent. Mike Gillich, yeah, he was innocent. He wasn't involved in the murder. John Ransom, he was also innocent. Laura Sharp, she left before the conspiracy even supposedly happened. Nix tried to position himself as a charming manipulator, not a killer. And I mean, he really had nothing to lose admitting to the scams. He's already in jail for life. It really did not matter. Now, getting another murder charge or conspiracy on top of that could possibly change things. And again, he was trying to make all this money in hope of political favors or defense attorneys to help him get out of, his already life sentence. By the time everybody testified, no one really knew what the jury was thinking and what they were going to do. And that made Lynn very, very nervous. Lynn had spent so much time and effort into finding her parents' killers. And then the verdict came back. The jury found the defendants guilty on the central conspiracy counts. The word landed hard in the courtroom, and Lynn felt joy, and she admitted it. Not just relief, actual joy. After years of threats, fear, humiliation, rumors, and confusion, someone had finally been held accountable. But even the verdict was messy. John Ransom was acquitted on some of the specific murder for hire counts. Not necessarily because jurors believe he was innocent, but because the indictment tied certain counts to very specific dates that the evidence did not support cleanly. Some jurors believe the broader story, but not the narrow timing of events. One juror said he believed the ingredients, not the spices. And that line sums up the whole case. The core story felt true to jurors, but the details were messy. Now, of course, there's more to this first trial. But this episode is already long enough. If you want more information on it, a great resource and book that I pulled a lot of information from is a book called Mississippi Mud. It is a fantastic book, told a lot through Lynn's point of view. Talks a lot more about Rex Armistead and his background, and just gives a lot more information on this whole entire case. This could probably be like a 4-hour episode, but I wanted to condense it down some. So if you want more information, that would be a great resource to go read. Several jurors later said that they would have actually convicted Pete Hallett if he had been charged. It was his name, his office, his conduct, his affidavits, his money handling, his relationship with Kirksey Nix. It was all over the place. His fingerprints were all over this case, yet he was not charged. And at sentencing, something else kind of strange happened, or maybe not so strange. Mike Gillich had enormous support. Letters came in from business leaders and everyday citizens. People wrote about his generosity, his kindness, the jobs he provided, and the good things he had done in the community. To the Sherry family, that was odd and kind of painful. And it's weird that, a community could admire a man for his favors, money and jobs, and personal kindness while ignoring or minimizing the damage connected to him. But to me, this is also how the Dixie Mafia is able to do, what they did. They do favors for folks, or for some folks. But also, over here, they're also doing some pretty heinous crimes. But for that 1991 trial, there were convictions. Now, Kirksey Nix received 15 years in federal prison, stacked on top of the life sentence he was already serving. Mike Gillich also received 15 years in federal prison, followed by 3 years of probation. John Ransom received 10 years in federal prison, followed by 3 years of probation. And old Laura Sharp, she was sentenced to 20 years in federal prison because she actually got convicted by 2 counts. Count 1 and count 2, which had to do with the wire fraud and the whole Lonely Hearts scam. She was tied pretty closely to the scam itself, and because of those 2 counts, she got 20 years. After the 1991 trial, the case still had one enormous hole in it, and of course that is Pete Hallett, and he had not been charged, right? His name had run through the investigation, like I said, but witnesses had raised questions about, his behavior before and after the murders. Jurors would later say it was likely that they would have convicted him if he had been sitting at the defense table. But in 1991, Pete Hallett was still outside the indictment, and one reason was Mike Gillich. At the first trial, Gillich did not give prosecutors Pete Hallett. He did the opposite. He testified that Pete was not involved in the scam or the murders. Without Gillich turning on him, the government did not believe it had enough to bring Pete Hallett into the case. But the investigation did not stop. After the 1991 convictions, federal investigators kept digging into Pete's role. They kept following the money, the records, the office connections, the prison access, the document trail. And then, in 1994, Mike Gillich changed his position. Gillich was already convicted and serving time. Cooperation gave him something he badly needed, and that was leverage. He agreed to cooperate with the government in return for a possible reduction in his sentence. And once Gillich started talking, the case really shifted. He admitted that Pete Hallett had been involved in the scams and the murders. He told prosecutors that Pete had blamed Vincent Sherry for the money. And that's how we get to this and how I mentioned that earlier. He described the murder discussions. He connected Hallett to the conversations before and after the killings. And he gave prosecutors a new version of the actual hit. According to Mike Gillich, John Ransom was not the man who walked into the Sherry home and pulled the trigger. The shooter, he said, not John Ransom, it was Thomas Leslie Holcomb. Thomas Holcomb was a Texas-based hitman. He was not a political enemy of Margaret Sherry. He was not someone with a known personal feud with Vincent Sherry. Holcomb was just hired muscle. He came into the story because Nix and Gillich needed someone willing to kill for money. Gillich and Nix had agreed to split the cost of killing Vincent Sherry. They considered different people, including John Ransom and another guy named Robert Halal, but ultimately they selected Holcomb for $20,000. Back in early September 1987, Pete supposedly asked Gillich how things were progressing, with the murder for hire plot. Gillich told him that the hit was on, and Pete offered to pay half. But Gillich had said it was already handled, don't worry about it. A few days later, Pete told Gillich that the Sherry children would not be at the house because they lived elsewhere. After the murders, Pete asked Gillich whether he needed to be concerned about everything. And Gillich told him, you're good. Don't worry about anything. And then came the cleanup. Pete brought Gillich documents connected to the Nix scam and said police would be going through his office. Nix instructed Gillich to destroy these documents. About a year later, Pete brought more Nix-related records to Gillich for disposal. In the fall of 1989, just before public records tied to Pete, more directly to the murders and everything, if you remember, Pete's office manager retrieved the Nix files and took them to Pete at City Hall. So, according to Gillich, Pete was covering his tracks and destroying the Nix-related documents. In 1996, prosecutors returned with a much broader indictment against Nix, now Holcomb, Laura Sharp, and also now Pete Hallett. This time, the case was not built narrowly around John Ransom and specific travel dates that didn't quite match up the first time. It was built as a racketeering enterprise. The government argued that fraud, obstruction, money handling, prison communications, and murder were all part of one larger criminal system. The 1997 trial finally put Pete in the defendant's chair. By then, he was no longer just a friend or the former law partner, the man who found the bodies, or the former mayor standing at the edge of the story. He was being prosecuted as part of the enterprise that led to the murders. Notice I said former mayor, because Pete had lost re-election. The government presented the trust accounts, Laura's office access, the false paralegal affidavits that we mentioned before, the prison communication, the missing money, and the blame placed on Vincent, the murder discussions, the children, not at home detail, the statements after the killings, all of the things that we've been talking about that Pete had been involved in the show are now being out in front of everybody, and that the government was saying, like, hey, Pete is very much a part of this, and he's part of the whole criminal system here. The defense argued that Pete did not know the full extent of the criminal nature of what was happening, and that he was being blamed by people trying to save themselves. By this time, prosecutors had strong evidence than they did in 1991 with all of the things. And Gillich's cooperation gave them an insider account finally. And records supported major parts of the timeline. And also Pete's own conduct gave them a pattern. Now, there's a lot more to this 1997 case, too. And again, you should definitely go read the book Mississippi Mud. I'm going to skip a lot of it because, again, this could be a 4-hour show. But after the jury deliberated, the verdicts in the 1997 case finally gave the Sherry family something that the 1991 trial had not fully delivered. This time, Pete Hallett was not a witness hovering around the edges of the story. He was convicted. Thomas Leslie Holcomb was not a rumor or a name buried inside someone else's theory. He was convicted too. Pete Hallett was found guilty of RICO conspiracy, obstruction of justice, conspiracy to obstruct justice, and conspiracy to commit wire fraud. The jury did not find that Pete Hallett pulled the trigger. Of course, he himself did not kill Vincent and Margaret Sherry. That was not the government's case. The government's case was that Pete Hallett was part of the criminal enterprise around Nix's scam, helped create the conditions that led to Vincent Sherry being blamed for the missing money, and then helped obstruct the investigation afterward. For that, the former mayor of Biloxi and former law partner of Vincent Sherry was sentenced to 18 years in federal prison. Thomas Holcomb received life in prison. After all the years when John Ransom had looked like he was the suspected hitman, after the silencer, the Georgia arrest, the testimony from Peggy, and the confusion around the first trial, the latter case finally put the government's alleged triggerman in front of the jury, and they gave him life. Now, keep in mind, John Ransom was not charged with the murder, so he didn't get off, after Thomas was convicted. John was sentenced for other crimes related to the scam and conspiracy and everything like that. Kirk C. Nix received an additional life sentence, which, it's more symbolic than anything else, but I am glad, and the Sherry family was glad that he was at least held responsible for that. But now Kirksey is serving 2 life sentences in jail. So you might be wondering where, everybody is now. So Kirksey Nix he's still in prison. He has sought compassionate release because of poor health. A federal court denied a recent bid for his release in 2025, and he is still behind bars. Thomas Holcomb, the gunman, the hitman, he was sentenced to life in prison. He died in prison in 2005. Mike Gillich, as I said, cooperated with prosecutors in 1994, and it was his cooperation that helped reshape the case against Pete Hallett and brought in Thomas Holcomb and kind of shined a light on the true story here. Gillich was sentenced to 20 years, but because of his cooperation, he eventually served far less time than he would have. But he ended up dying of cancer in 2012. Laura Sharp was also convicted, and she was released from federal prison back in 2002. And from everything I can gather, she has relocated down in Florida. John Ransom was convicted in that 1991 case, as part of the conspiracy and possible hitman, which was later tied to Thomas Holcomb. But Ransom was released from federal prison in late 2003 and reportedly returned to the Atlanta area. Now, Pete Hallett was released from federal custody in 2013 after serving almost 16 years of his 18-year sentence. And WLBT reported in 2023 that Pete Hallett was 81 and still lives on the coast, meaning that's the Mississippi Gulf Coast. And Pete has been interviewed after his release, and he said, "I absolutely had nothing to do with their murders. And I have absolutely no doubt when I get up there being, I guess, heaven, but I have absolutely no doubt when I get up there that Vincent and Margaret will be standing next to me, and they will embrace me." It's a bold statement, but Pete is steadfast on the fact that he had nothing to do with it. The Sherry home itself became a kind of haunted landmark in Biloxi. It stood for years after the murders, empty and decaying, a physical reminder of the night Vincent and Margaret were killed and of the civic rot the case exposed. Author Edward Humes, who wrote Mississippi Mud, later wrote that the house had become a decaying monument to the corruption and violence that ended their lives. Hurricane Katrina also damaged it badly, and years later the city moved towards tearing it down completely. The Sherry family never got to simply grieve in private. Their parents' death became a public scandal, a federal case, a book, multiple podcast episodes. I mean, I'm doing one now. There were news specials. There was a lot of courtroom drama. It was local legend and a permanent stain on Biloxi's history. The family got convictions, but not a clean ending. They got answers, but only after years of confusion and pain. They got justice, but justice arrived late and incomplete. But the family survived it. They fought through it. They forced people to keep looking. But no verdict could give them back Vincent and Margaret Sherry. No sentence could undo years spent wondering who to trust, who was lying, and how deep the corruption went. The story was never buried, and that's largely due to Lynn, who kept fighting, to the whole entire Sherry family who kept fighting, because if they wouldn't have, I'm almost positive nothing would have ever come of this. No one would have been held accountable, and I think that's how the Dixie Mafia operated. They banked on people not talking, not cooperating, or digging in too much. Sometimes the people that could and should do the digging were also involved. And that's what we say about kind of like the good old boy system, and that was the Dixie Mafia. But because of the fight from Lynn and others, people were held accountable. Because of them, especially Lynn, people were brought to justice. That's all I got for this episode. This was a long one, and like I said, I probably could have made this a 4-hour episode, and I don't think that you would probably want to sit through all of that. But let me know if you've listened this far. Reach out to me. Do you like longer episodes? Do you care how long these are? My poor producer Coriensko, who helps me a lot, he probably doesn't like these being that long. But I appreciate you sticking to the end of this. And always a big thank you to my producer, Coriensko, for keeping me on track and helping me run the show here. And if you enjoy episodes like this, deep dives, history, true crime, you should consider joining my Patreon. It's a community that we have. It's called the Hidden Pond Lodge. It really helps fund the show. That's where I share bonus content, extended discussions, and kind of lodge exclusive materials tied to episodes like this one. It's only $4 a month. Besides the Patreon page, you get access to our community Discord, where we chat about all types of things and topics: history, folklore, fly fishing, bourbon, beer, wine, gardening, hiking, all types of other things. And like I mentioned, we've got a book club and a bird club. So lots of stuff going on. And of course, we could talk about the podcast episodes. And again, let me know how you feel about the longer episodes, shorter episodes. We're trying to cover a lot of different topics for you guys. So I'm hoping that these are beneficial and entertaining. But again, I really do appreciate you all tuning in. And everybody, I will talk to you soon.